Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining another chapter of our webinar series. We're very excited today. First of all, we want to thanks IPWA, International Poultry Welfare Alliance. We're very excited of keep doing this webinar and keep the collaboration. And we have a very special guest today, Molly Parker. She's a veterinarian with Celeste Genetics. And besides this introduction, Molly is gonna be sharing the key welfare indicators to improve turkey welfare. And for us, Poultry School, we're very honored to present our first webinar ever in the poultry industry. So, Molly, the time is yours. This presentation is gonna be around 45, 50 minutes. This is gonna be recorded. And then after, we're gonna be sharing this video in our social media and in our platforms. And our main mission is to keep providing knowledge, technology, and thank you, Molly, for your time, and thank you for having this passion to share your knowledge. Go ahead, Molly.
All right, thank you very much. I'm very excited to be here this afternoon to talk about key welfare indicators to help improve turkey welfare. Anyone who knows me knows that I'm quite passionate about turkeys are their own species. They're not just a big chicken. So hopefully this presentation will walk through an overview of key welfare indicators as well as look at dive into a few of those KWIs to see how they might be different in turkeys compared to chickens. Get my slides to advance. There we go. So start with kind of giving an overview of animal welfare and KWIs. For those of you who listened to Karen Christensen's presentation about broiler KWIs a few weeks ago, it might be a bit familiar, but for those who did not, we define animal welfare, and when I say we, I mean the World Organization for Animal Health, as the physical and mental state of an animal in relation to the conditions in which it lives. But anyone who interacts with poultry or animals in general knows that whenever you provide animal care, that's quite complex. And it certainly requires customization, not only for the species, but also for the age or type of animal, as well as the environment in which they're in. So the International Poultry Welfare Alliance recognizes that there are many different definitions and standards for poultry welfare throughout the world. And so part of the goal with creating these KWIs was that we would have a holistic approach to welfare, and therefore the KWI guide could help improve the overall welfare state and outcomes for poultry around the world. So whenever we were putting together these KWIs, we wanted to encourage the global poultry industry to measure and share their progress across the supply chain, all the way from breeders, hatcheries, farms, transportation, and processing. But that being said, the International Poultry Welfare Alliance is a large group, over 500 individuals across 85 organizations, and we wanted it to encompass the entire supply chain as well. So past processing into further processing, as well as into retail and food service. And this reference, or this KWI guide, is a reference for all aspects of the supply chain, not just necessarily those who handle live birds. This guide can also provide leading information and drive continuous improvement in welfare. So what are key welfare indicators and what are they not? So with key welfare indicators, as we were developing them, we wanted to make sure that they were outcomes-based where possible. So that means they're being measured based on the bird, the flock, or in the housing environment. So this is a shift away from kind of how welfare has traditionally been measured, in that it has traditionally been resource-based, where it might be measured on something that's food or water availability. And now we're looking at more outcomes-based measurements because we feel those are more accurate as to the actual welfare of the bird. We also wanted to make sure that these KWIs were considerate of all poultry housing systems and sizes, from small, maybe one house farms, all the way up to, larger integrated systems like you might think about in more developed nations. And also note that, not all KWIs may apply to each operation type. We also wanted to make sure that the KWIs would be able to be implemented for folks who are in various stages of their welfare journey. Some folks that are further along might have dedicated resources and staff and quite a bit of technology. And other folks might be quite literally a one-person show in that they themselves are providing for the birds, caretaking for them, as well as also working to improve the welfare. We also wanted to be inclusive of all regions and types of production, and not just be focused on poultry production in developed poultry markets. We want to make sure that this was applicable to poultry throughout the world. And so therefore we worked to note whenever the group that put this together, where we had gaps in our group, and reach out to folks in geographical areas throughout the world where we might not have good representation, to ensure that these KWIs would be applicable in those areas as well. We also wanted to make sure that the KWIs were defined in a way that would be accessible to the frontline folks, the ones who are actually on the farms or in the processing plant caring and managing for the birds, or to inform the folks who might be purchasing the product further up the supply chain. We also want to be able to make sure these KWIs would be used to guide improvements of a specific welfare outcome, so that you could utilize the KWIs. Each KWI could be used by itself, or it could be utilized in conjunction with other KWIs. And then we also want to make sure that whenever we're giving this guide to someone, it has implementation instructions and resources to ensure that that data can be used to guide improvements. So that being said, KWIs they're not a prescriptive performance or compliance standard. This is not an audit tool. This is not an audit standard. And therefore, you'll notice throughout the guide, and even in some of the examples that we have, we tended to steer away from putting numbers in there, because the numbers might depend on where you're at in the world, your housing system, or what other expectations might be within your organization. We also wanted to make sure that any indicators were based on substantial science and not just theorized recommendations. So all these KWIs have been vetted through thorough reviews and diverse input. We also wanted to make sure, as I'd already mentioned, that we encompass all poultry producing areas of the world, and that we included those who might not be in consideration of what you would think of maybe a vertically integrated system in a developed market. We wanted to ensure we were looking at all production systems across all geographic areas. So folks who might just be beginning their welfare journey, compared to some who might already be a little further advanced. We also recognize that the KWIs, these are not all encompassing. Some best practices within poultry production are not listed in this guide due to either being variable depending on where you're at, or other factors. And then these were also not self-serving of any company or interest organization. While there was a diverse group within the International Poultry Welfare Alliance that put these together, all contributors and leaders set aside their vested interests in order to ensure that what we put into this guide was indeed best for the poultry and the future of poultry production as it aligns with IPWA values. So, why is that distinction important between outcomes-based and resource-based? Because we know input changes into the production system do not necessarily guarantee an improvement in welfare outcomes. One of the things that we felt strongly about was that the influence of stockmanship, and really just the care by the grower or the frontline person caring for those birds, has a significant impact on the welfare outcome of poultry flocks. And if we focus on input changes, we felt that that provided a message to producers and consumers that if they are just simply compliant with the input changes, then that will guarantee good welfare outcomes. So, like I said, the KWIs, they're not a set of requirements, and they're flexible and customizable to be utilized however they best fit into your operation. And so they can be a reference for farms, hatcheries, processing, and transportation, and can be used in a way that helps you achieve your goals and your standards. So the KWIs guides, they include various key welfare indicators, and KWIs, for a definition really, are factors that can be measured, monitored, and managed to assess and improve poultry welfare. I mentioned previously that this KWI guide is not all-encompassing, and so the indicators that we put into this guide were the ones that we determined had the highest potential for improvement, ways to improve welfare, or they held pretty substantial risk if they were not monitored effectively. That being said, we certainly recognize management practices are crucial to poultry welfare, but because those can vary across production systems, geographic areas, etc., we did not include any husbandry direction within this guide. So within the turkey guide, there's several different key welfare indicators for the various points within production. So on farm, the KWIs listed are air quality, flock mortality, litter quality, cull tracking, foot pad condition, mobility and leg condition, and flock condition. At processing, the KWIs we felt were important were injury tracking, processing effectiveness, and defects reported. Within transport and handling, we looked at different KWIs, if the birds are being transported from farm directly to processing, or if they're being transported between facilities. And then finally, at the hatchery, we looked at cull tracking, injury tracking, and poult comfort. So to help better understand this, I'm going to dive into a few of these KWIs and talk about how they relate within the context of the KWI guide. So every KWI starts with a definition. So here we're going to talk about litter quality. So within the guide, we have a definition of what litter quality is, which is the assessment of the condition of the substrate or material covering the ground or floor of the poultry environment. We also have in here, as you can see here in the middle, we kind of call out if litter quality is closely tied in with some other KWIs. For example, litter quality, air quality, leg condition, breast skin condition, and foot pad condition can all be closely connected, and therefore, if possible, is best to be used and analyzed together. That being said, different production types and substrates will determine if excess moisture is, more or less of a challenge. So, while we're looking at this, we also want to make sure that we're assessing and managing litter quality regularly to help prevent foot health issues and detect flock health challenges sooner. So the next section within the guide talks about observations. So for example, with litter moisture, we can do a clump test do a quick test of litter quality. For those who have been within the poultry industry for a while, you're probably quite familiar with the clump test, but basically it's pretty simple. It's just a matter of picking up a handful of a litter substrate, ideally with a glove on, and making sure you're picking it from a representative location. So that being said, picking it from a central location or various locations throughout the houses, but ideally avoiding areas directly underneath any feeders or drinkers. We know that those areas tend to clump quite quickly just due to the excess traffic over them, and that's not necessarily where birds spend most of their time. So therefore, we'll make sure we're picking up litter for a test at various spots throughout the house. And basically you pick it up and you squeeze it in your hand and see how well it compacts. So if you squeeze it and it remains in a clump and it has excess moisture coming out of it whenever you squeeze it, that's a pretty good indicator that it's likely too wet. That being said, if it's loose and it flakes, then that means the moisture content is acceptable. So that being said, too wet litter is certainly an issue, but on the other end of the spectrum, too dry litter can certainly be a welfare issue as well. And so if you have litter which is too dry, you can have excess dust observed in the environment, and that ties in to the air quality KWI that actually that Karen Christensen spoke about a few weeks earlier with the broiler focus. So that being said, we talked about observations. So with measurements, you've picked up, you've observed your litter, and then you want to ideally find a way to measure and record this. So you want to use, for example, a table or a chart to track the samples for each barn at various ages. And that could be within whatever welfare standard that's most applicable for your production type and environment. Or that can be ideally if it is a predetermined age. And then potentially, if you wanted to do a more accurate moisture assessment, you could use a testing device to verify the moisture percentage that's present in litter sampled. But if you're just beginning your welfare journey with litter quality, the clump test is probably going to be the easiest. So as we said, we're going to start by collecting and tracking data, and we want to make sure that we're conducting recurring litter quality observations or measurements, making sure that we're using a testing method that's available and applicable to the production environment you're in. And then we also want to set and evaluate the protocol. So determine who is going to be or which role or worker within that environment is going to be responsible for being the one that actually collects and observes the litter quality, how they're going to do it, making sure they're trained, and then how often is it going to be done. A lot of those things are going to be based around one, just the environment and the challenge, but also the available labor and the technology to do this. You also want to make sure, as we're setting and evaluating protocols, that that we also have a protocol for troubleshooting, what's a possible solution if we suspect we have a litter quality issue. And so, what corrective actions can be taken to ensure that the quality levels remain within the ideal range for bird health and to improve positive outcomes. So after you start there, how can you improve? Let's say you're already there. You can improve by, making sure we're always reviewing and improving protocols. So conducting a thorough analysis of the protocols in place to make sure we're actually taking action when a deviation is discovered. Making sure that the people collecting this data, are they adequately trained, and has that training been properly administered? And then if not, making sure we're revisiting the responsible parties and the opportunities to potentially invest in environment or technology improvements or training, which may help address some of these issues and improve positive welfare outcomes. So the other thing we can also look at is, over time, ideally we've collected litter quality results, making sure we're recording those and then comparing those with other KWIs, those ones that I mentioned earlier, and how do they compare to track and analyze trends, as well as to make sure we're making corrective actions to improve outcomes. So for example, if we consistently know we're having wet litter during a certain time of the year, or while using a certain type of litter, or at any other kind of common point, we can look at those trends to determine, can we take an additional corrective action to help prevent litter quality issues in future flocks. And ideally, we want to work up to more frequent assessments in more areas until we have enough litter quality data being collected with the best tools available and applicable to that production type. So another KWI that we look at the farm level is cull tracking. And so cull tracking is going to be the assessment of the number and type of occurrences of bird euthanasia for insight into the welfare of that bird, of the flock, and of future flocks. And so for clarification, this is a separate KWI from the mortality KWI. We have a bird mortality KWI that is for mortality which is picked up. This cull tracking KWI is for birds which have been identified for euthanasia and need to be euthanized by the caretaker. So it's important to remember with euthanasia, there's different approved methods for euthanasia for different types of poultry, different types of production systems, and depending on where you're at in the world, can also be influenced by regional, national, or other standards. So within this guide, because it can vary so much globally, we did not include details on any specific euthanasia methods, just because there's so many regulatory variances. But there are some best practices that are fairly consistent globally. So with, and if you've already looked through the KWI guide, you'll notice that the cull tracking KWI is very similar to the mortality KWI in that you want to make sure, for lack of a better word, we're all speaking the same language. So you want to make sure that we have a defined start and end time for what constitutes a day, as well as a defined start and end time for what constitutes a week. making sure that we're being consistent with our measurements ensures that we have accurate data. And then, sometimes it might be easier to consult with other folks throughout the supply chain to determine if you already have a defined start and end time in place, either within the farm or the company already, particularly around things like mortality and cold tracking, where we are euthanizing birds. We typically already have other set time points in place just for the sole purpose of knowing for production numbers, just knowing how many birds we have on the farm. But you want to make sure that those measurements are consistent, so then you can have accurate data for better, higher level data analysis. It is certainly important, mortality and culls, for them to be tracked separately and clearly with consistent definitions. So why do we look at cull rates? Well, similar to litter quality, you can have too much or too little. Same thing with cull rates. High cull rates could be indication that the flock's undergoing a health challenge and might need to reevaluate some health plans. Whereas lower cull rates, while it certainly could indicate a very healthy flock that just doesn't have a lot of issues, it could also indicate a need for better making sure that we're doing some better decision making around euthanasia and management training. So, as I already said, whenever we look at culls, there's several ways to look at it. We could look at it daily cull tracking. So basically, you set whatever your predetermined day is. Is it the 24 hours on Monday? Is it the end of the second shift? Is it at 8 p.m. every day, etc.? And then that number would be the number of birds euthanized at the farm on that day up until the point they're transported to a different facility. And then weekly is making sure that criteria is consistent as well. When does your week begin and when does it end? Does your week run Monday morning through Sunday evening, or is it Sunday morning through Saturday evening? And like I said, typically you might already have those in place just from a production standpoint, but making sure whenever we're setting up things like cull tracking, that we're trying to stay consistent to allow for better analysis. And then the other part that's really important with cull tracking is making sure we're doing it by category. So making sure we're identifying and recording the reason that we're culling each bird. For example, is it injured? Does it have is there something conformationally wrong with it? Does it have bad legs? Or does it have a really big drop crop or a pendulous crop? Is it just pecked on? Why are we euthanizing these birds? So that way we can evaluate those trends over time and determine if we can improve them. So, and ideally you have ideally you have an overall cull rate that you kind of expect to have. But if you track the reasons for those culls, it might help you uncover details that can provide for additional welfare improvements. So for example, if we have a high percentage of culls, that can be attributed to something that's preventable, whether that be you have birds getting caught up in equipment. You have a lot of culls, a lot of injured birds after they're handled. You might have some nutritional issues that might cause, leg issues or conformation issues. That cause can then be investigated and corrected. So, similar to the litter quality, we're going to want to start by collecting data. So we're going to make sure we record, like I said, the total number of culls at that flock level, or ideally even better if possible at the house level if the flock consists of more than one house. You want to do that both daily and weekly. And then you want to be able to track those culls over time and conduct a data analysis on it to determine if you have any trends. And if you do have large trends, what are reasons for any significant deviations on that trend line, both positive and negative? Or if you don't already have an established cull range, you can use this data to establish a cull rate range for your operation. And that can certainly, be further influenced by rates that are already in that geographic region or specific times of the year, as well as consulting with best practices, both for the breed of bird you have, as well as within your organization. And then finally, you also want to make sure, once again, you set protocols. So you have a plan to discuss and investigate any causes if you do observe a deviation. And your action level for something like calls, that can be created based on an increased call level, a decrease in call level, or call levels that just trigger in whatever level you set to trigger corrective action or further investigation. So once you've established that, then if you want to work on improving this, you can, expand not only the volume and detail of data. Maybe you started with just one flock, and then you move it to analyzing your calls across the entire operation. But you also want to be looking at these regularly to make sure you gain further insight into husbandry or other adjustments that could reduce the need for culling and increase positive outcomes. For example, if you're having a lot of culls due to what you think is a health reason, then you can work with your veterinarian to determine, do we need to adjust the vaccination program? Are you having a lot of culls that you think are related to birds being too light or too heavy? You can work with your nutritionist to adjust the nutritional formula for those birds. So you also can conduct kind of an intentional review after you made an intervention or you put a new protocol in place. This can help you determine whether that adjustment was effective or whether more work is needed. So for example, you reached out to your veterinarian, you adjusted your vaccination program or your health plan, and then if you already have that data, you can now look at the additional data you have after that change was made to determine if it was effective or not. And then finally, you also want to assess the call categories with the front level folks, the folks that are working with the birds every day, so the decision makers, to determine if there is, any sort of training or worker related improvements that can be made, especially with euthanasia of birds. There's certainly sometimes where you have folks that just don't really like to do it. It's hard for them to do, and so sometimes they put it off until eventually that bird just dies, which is not okay. So we need to work with those folks to have them understand here's why we need to euthanize birds in a timely manner if they have this sort of injury or reason for euthanasia, and then that can help guide the decision, because if that person is uncomfortable with it, then finding someone else who is comfortable with it, or a different method for that person to be comfortable with euthanizing the bird. So also want to make sure that we're conducting a thorough analysis of all these protocols that are in place to take action when we do see a deviation or a big swing up or down. And this can once again help us determine if adequate training is available and has been administered to the person involved. You also want to make sure you revisit with the responsible parties and any opportunity you have to invest in environment or technological improvements or training to address these issues and to help increase positive welfare outcomes. And then finally, you can always compare data. So share that call data with members of not only your internal supply chain, but also other collaborating partners to compare against other flocks or farms to better understand is the number of calls you have or the reason that these birds are being culled within the expected range, or can there be improvements be made by implementing better practices? So then finally, the third KWI that I'm going to discuss is poult comfort. And so this is related to the hatchery. So poult comfort is going to be defined as the bird and the environment-based assessments that characterize the welfare of the bird within the hatchery environment. Once again, this is also one that can be used as an intentional review after we've done an intervention or a new protocol introduction to evaluate whether that adjustment was effective. And the results for this KWI can be tracked and compared with previous hatchery results, especially at the hatchery. This data can be used to provide further insight into hatchery equipment function, maintenance, and you can also look at early farm results, typically thought of as a 7-day mortality number, or maybe a starve out or a 4-day mortality number, and can allow for more comprehensive corrective actions. So as we want to measure, we ideally want to use a table or a chart to help quantify the KWI on each day that poults are hatched. So these measurements can be used to investigate if there's a deviation in the hatch process or the environment that might present a welfare challenge. So with poult comfort, there's not necessarily a single metric to track or trend over time, but rather looking at them all together may indicate a need for corrective action or further analysis of other KWIs. So environmentally, you just kind of can assess the hatchery environment for adequate space and thermal comfort. I mean, quite frankly, is it just the room temperature, right? It is the temperature within whatever the expected temperature threshold should be. But throughout the day and in the rooms where the poults are hatched, processed, and held prior to transport. And you can always vary where and when this environmental assessment is done throughout processing in order to make sure you have a complete representative data set. The other thing that can be done is to do a bird-based assessment. So this involves measuring the body temperature of the poults within the hatchery. So, look at the birds, do they observe any sign of discomfort, but then also document the poult vent temperature and the behavior throughout the day in all these rooms where poults are being held. So you can look at vent temperatures of ideally a random selection of individual birds from various boxes. So you want to make sure that if you're looking at a box of poults, you're getting poults from all 4 quadrants. Most of the time, the boxes are usually split into 4 quadrants, as well as if the poults are in a stack, you want to make sure you're looking at stacks on the top, middle, and bottom. And then if they're in an area like a holding room or within a poult processing room, that you're looking at boxes in various areas across the room, not just certain areas. And what you can do is you can use a digital thermometer. So for example, like a rectal thermometer or an ear thermometer to just objectively measure the body temperature and then track and record that. It's also important too, if you see, if as you do the environmental assessment, you're looking throughout the room and you feel a draft come through, or you look and you see these poults look like they're huddled in the box and are cold. It's important to look at those and try and objectively measure those as well. So then when it comes to, observing the poult behavior, like I said, huddling, panting, or any sort of abnormal vocalization can certainly indicate poult comfort or discomfort, but it's important to make sure you have a protocol in place for taking corrective action if you do observe discomfort. And then when it comes to environmental observations, if you see a bird behavior that might indicate possible discomfort, you want to make sure that you're assessing the environment. Like, has there been an adjustment in the stocking density? Are we now putting more poults into a box or less poults into a box? Are we using a different type of crate or box? Has the ventilation changed? Has the height of the stack changed? Has any equipment changed? And these can all be used to look at, thermal discomfort, ventilation issues, or any spacing issues that might be present as well. If you have boxes, stacks of boxes in the holding room, you want to make sure you have adequate air between them. But you also want to make sure you're setting a protocol for all these things for having corrective action if you observe anything abnormal. So you want to start, like I said, observing and setting the protocols, and then you want to record and collect the data. So environmental results, vent temperatures, and then behavioral observations, which can certainly be subjective sometimes. But you want to establish a baseline for the hatchery. So you want to make sure you're measuring any deviations that you have. You have an agreed upon baseline whenever you start, and then you're measuring any deviations. And then after you've started and you're doing that, you want to make sure you're improving by, for example, tracking your deviations over time to identify where birds are getting stressed at. And you want to look at them by area. Is it just this corner of the service room or just this corner of the holding room? And you also want to be able to analyze trends as they relate to specific areas, so you can determine if any interventions are related to the ventilation system, incubation program, equipment, or any sort of hatchery staff or process flow, and making sure any changes there are effective. Once again, you can also utilize this to do an intentional review after you make an intervention, or you implement a new protocol to determine if that adjustment was actually effective in improving the positive outcome or if further work is needed. And then, as I mentioned previously, you can also compare this with other KWIs, such as cull tracking at the hatchery level, poult injuries, and early mortality within the rearing environment or the farm environment, to better understand and use those metrics to track improvement. So whenever we look at the KWIs, we start by building the base of a welfare knowledge to help drive these initiatives through the supply chain that are going to improve animal welfare. And so as we start with the knowledge, we can then use that knowledge to help drive initiatives to producers in a way that is, possible and impactful for the industry, but then also use it to help customers and consumers, the folks who might not be seeing birds every day or having their hands on birds, help them understand what good welfare looks like. It's certainly important for us to be proactive about welfare and tell our story in a way that customers and consumers and those not familiar with the poultry industry can understand welfare and feel good about the food they eat. And so we can do all of that results in it being kind of a win-win for not only the customers and the consumers and the producers, but also for the birds as well. So, like I said, I gave a kind of a brief overview of a few KWIs within the Turkey Guide. And then if you're interested in learning more and you look on the International Poultry Welfare Alliance website, they have KWI guides as well as online learning modules that you can look through. Right now we have them in English and Spanish, and currently working on a few other languages as well. And like I said, they're designed to be written at a level that hopefully and some of these online learning modules at a level that the frontline folks who are handling the birds can understand and easily digest. And so if you are interested in learning more, the International Poultry Welfare Alliance website is poultrywelfare.org. So that's pretty easy to remember. And then also if you have any further questions, you can always reach out to the Executive Director, Ryan Bennett, as well as Elena Meyer, who is the Director of Marketing and Communications. So that is
fantastic.
Fantastic,
Molly. Thank you very much for this presentation. Basically has a lot of information, and I think that also you guys have been done a really fantastic work creating these guides, and I think it's a lot of value, not just for the USA, but for globally. And I may understand that every other country, they have their flow and they have their process regarding a animal welfare. But I think that this is a very, very magnificent job. And thank you very much for your presentation. So we have a question here. Can you read it? Can you reach it?
Let's see in the Q&A. Yeah, certainly. So the question is, do you see that hatcheries that share the poult information with the growers and vice versa? Has this created any system level impacts to improve welfare? Yeah, certainly. As far as seeing hatcheries that have shared welfare information about the poults, as far as a lot of hatcheries particularly within the US, which is a more obviously developed poultry country, undergo various welfare audits that do incorporate some of these KWIs, but most are certainly quite open with sharing the results of those audits with the growers or the companies that are purchasing the poults. And then also it's always in conjunction with a lot of times with the growers that the company who owns the hatchery is looking at creating system level impacts to improve welfare. So for example, if we're wanting to do a change, let's say a change in pulp processing, a change in how we do beak treatment, it's certainly something that we'll communicate with the growers because we want their feedback. We know we've looked at the welfare at the hatchery level, but obviously that bird is going out to the farm where it's going to spend pretty much its entire life. So we want that feedback to ensure that what we're doing at the hatchery is not only ideal welfare there, but ideal welfare for the bird throughout the rest of its life.
So thank you, Molly. I have a personal question.
Yes.
For example, through your presentation, you use a lot the word observation, right? So yes. Part of that feeling, part of that, let's say, experience in being in contact with the turkeys, and now with all this trend or AI is, let's say, is a trend, artificial intelligence. how do you see that core, let's say, nature of the veterinarian, the people that is passionate going into the farms, and then using this tool that every other day they are more popular, and obviously we're facing a big improvement of all these tools. How do you see the future, and how we can use better this trend?
Yeah, no, that's a fantastic question. Because you are correct. Artificial intelligence is certainly on the rise, and it's one of the things where I think there's certainly a use for it. Um, and it's something that we need to figure out how to best utilize within the industry for our benefit. I do feel that I don't think you can completely replace uh, some of the things we do with artificial intelligence, but we can certainly use it for our benefit to make us, make us more efficient. And I think it's no secret the poultry industry struggles with labor, just like a lot of other industries. Use that to help make us more efficient. And then the other added benefit, we talk a lot about the people and them caring for the birds. You do occasionally have someone who handles birds incorrectly, et cetera. And with artificial intelligence, that can hopefully help eliminate some of those folks incorrectly caring for the birds who might be taking out their frustrations on other things. But I do think it's something that has a place. We just need to figure out exactly where it is.
One more question, Molly. In regarding animal welfare, let's say concept, I know that maybe in the USA is a concept that is moving forward. Do you have any experience internationally in other countries how this movement is going, and maybe some ideas how we will like a community we need to approach this concept?
Yeah, that's a really good question as well. And it certainly depends on where globally you're at. There are certainly other areas in the world, Europe, for example, that have a lot of focus on welfare, and then you have some other countries that don't have nearly as a developed poultry industry. That welfare is still very much at the basic level. And I think a lot of how you look at that is and one of the things that we looked at with this KWI guide is some of these folks, like I said, they're just beginning their welfare journey. And their production system might not be anything like we would think of here in the US as a production system. So figuring out what's best for the bird within that production system, and then also making sure that the value is there, and that the the caretaker of those birds and hopefully the consumer understands the value of good animal welfare and things that can be done to improve it. But it's certainly a challenge depending on where you're at globally, and it's certainly it'll be interesting to see how it plays out.
Okay, perfect. We have another two questions, Molly. Can you see it? The first one is gonna like it. You're gonna like that question.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Uh,
Go
So,
ahead.
as someone who's quite passionate about turkeys, for those of us more familiar with broilers, are there special impacts of longer living and larger birds that impacts the prioritization of KWI objectives? Yes, exactly, 110%. So certainly, we turkeys are much longer lived than broilers. For commercial birds or meat birds, depending on their intended weight at slaughter, could be anywhere from 12 to 14 weeks old to 20 weeks old. And then in breeders, that time is quite a bit longer. So yes, there's certainly a bigger impact on things around health, turkey health in general, leg health, foot pad health, litter quality, some of those things that while they're certainly important in broilers, because turkeys are on the ground so much longer, those things do take quite a bit of precedence compared to other things.
Okay, we have another question, but I think my thinking that the next question is providing welfare to the bird will lose us money. Is that right? Maybe the intention of the question is if it's more expensive, if you need to put more money or resource to do that?
Yep. So, and that's a great question. Because that's certainly something that I hear a lot. And so that was kind of how we structured the KWI guides the way we did. You know, for those who might not be doing a lot with welfare or just starting that journey, you have kind of the basic start here, which is really, you probably saw the common theme among those KWIs I discussed, that the starting here was literally just kind of collecting and reporting data. It didn't require a lot of investment or a lot of money. So providing welfare to the bird doesn't necessarily cost money. Sometimes it's about doing little things that can add up to synergistically provide better welfare.
Well, perfect. I think that we covered a couple of questions. I think that is a very nice subject, and I think that we can talk here hours or so many subjects. So we would like to thank everybody for joining us. We have a very nice live audience. And like I said at the beginning, we at Poultry School are very happy, excited to be providing this kind of material information. And like I say before, this will be posted in a social media maybe in 1 week, and you will have the contacts of Molly and the IPWA to keep promoting this and pushing these concepts. Thank you very much, Molly, and thank you everybody for joining. See you soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you.